Right now, somewhere in Waupun, Wisconsin, inside a concrete cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, a man who has not breathed free air in over 2,700 days is sitting on the edge of a metal bunk. It is early morning. The facility is locked down and silent. The overhead light has not changed. The temperature has not changed. Nothing about this moment is different from the moment before it, or the moment before that, or any moment across the last 7 years. And the corrections officers who walk past his observation window during their overnight rounds keep reporting the same thing. He is awake. He is completely still. He is staring at the wall in front of him, and he has been that way for hours. That image, that specific, documented, repeatedly observed image is where this story begins. Not in August 2018, not in a courtroom in Colorado, not in the headlines that covered every development of this case from arrest through sentencing. Here, in the part that came after all of that, in the years that the cameras stopped covering, in the quiet that descended once the verdicts were read and the cell door closed and the world moved on to something else. The corrections officers who monitor Chris Watts around the clock have started describing changes in him that go beyond anything reported in mainstream coverage of this case. Changes that are not dramatic, not what most people would expect, and precisely because of that, far more significant than any visible breakdown could ever be. If you are new here, this is DAV Crime Records, and this channel is committed to covering cases like this one, with documented sources, psychological depth, and an unwavering focus on the people who deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button now, because what this documentary lays out goes deeper than anything currently being reported on this case, and you will want to be here for every part of it. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, in the quiet suburb of Frederick, Colorado, a family of 4, plus an unborn child, simply vanished. There was no note. There was no warning. There was no goodbye. A woman named Shanann Watts had returned home from a work trip to Arizona late the night before. Her 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, were asleep in their rooms. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with a son she and her husband had already named Nico. By the time the sun came up fully over that neighborhood on Saratoga Trail, none of them were there anymore. But this documentary is not about that morning. What happened on August 13th, 2018 has been covered extensively, carefully, and by sources far more immediate than this narration needs to revisit in full detail. What has not been covered, what has been quietly accumulating inside a Wisconsin correctional facility for 7 years, while the rest of the world focused on other things, is what comes next. This is the story of what happened after the cameras left. This is the documented account of what prolonged institutional isolation inside one of the most restrictive correctional environments in the American prison system does to a human mind over the course of 7 years. And this is what the people guarding Chris Watts every single day have been observing, and, in formal and informal accounts, describing to journalists, behavioral researchers, and documentary investigators who have been paying close attention. To understand where Chris Watts is in June of 2026, you have to go back to December 3rd, 2018. 6 weeks after sentencing. 6 weeks after a Colorado courtroom heard him plead guilty to the murders of his pregnant wife and both of his daughters. A transport vehicle arrived at the Colorado facility where he had been held since his arrest, and Chris Watts was moved, not to another unit, not to a different wing, across state lines, more than 1,000 miles from Colorado, away from every familiar geography, every connection, everything recognizable. The destination was Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. The official reason given by authorities was safety. The threat level from other inmates inside the Colorado facility had become, within just 6 weeks of his arrival in the correctional system, so persistent and so serious that standard protective measures were deemed insufficient. The only viable response, according to the people responsible for his containment, was to move him to a completely different state. Pause on what that actually means. A man enters the correctional system. He has been there for 6 weeks. And already the threats against him are severe enough that an interstate transfer is not just considered, it is executed. That is not a routine logistical decision. That is a system communicating, clearly and urgently, that it cannot manage what is happening inside that facility. What specifically was occurring in those 6 weeks inside the Colorado Department of Corrections that produced that response was never publicly detailed. No press conference addressed the specific nature of the threats. No document released to the public explained the precise circumstances. The transfer happened, the official statement cited safety, and that chapter was quietly closed. The facility they chose was not selected at random. Dodge Correctional Institution carries a history that distinguishes it from a standard maximum security prison. Before it housed inmates in its current capacity, the building itself functioned as a psychiatric institution for individuals classified as criminally dangerous. The walls of that facility have held some of the most psychologically complex individuals in American criminal history. It was designed specifically for people the correctional system has determined require the absolute highest level of containment, observation, and management. This is where Chris Watts has lived since December 2018. This is where he woke up this morning. Before the behavioral reports from inside that facility are examined, the environment producing those behaviors has to be understood in its exact specificity. Because without that understanding, what the corrections officers are describing sounds like observation. With it, it sounds like documentation of something that was always going to happen. Picture a space 8 feet by 10 feet, concrete walls, a metal bunk bolted to the surface, a steel fixture in the corner that serves as a bathroom, no privacy partition, one narrow window reinforced with layered glass, overhead lighting that operates on an institutional schedule, not on the rising and setting of the sun. That is the space Chris Watts occupies for 23 hours of every single day. The remaining hour, if his conduct has met the required standard for that day, is spent outside the cell. Then the door closes again. Meals do not happen at a table across from another human being. There is no cafeteria, no tray line, no brief moment of shared physical space with another person. A slot in the door opens. Food arrives. The slot closes. Monday is indistinguishable from the Sunday before it. A birthday happens in that room. The anniversary of August 13th happens in that room. Christmas happens in that room. Every single day that passes, for 7 years, has happened in that room. Now here is where the description of a prison cell becomes something more than a description of punishment. Because what has just been laid out is not simply a set of harsh conditions. It is a precise, specific, scientifically documented environment that researchers in neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and forensic psychiatry have studied in clinical settings for decades. And what those researchers have found is not a theory, it is a documented, staged, replicable clinical progression. International human rights bodies have classified prolonged isolation of this nature, this duration, this intensity, not as severe punishment, but as severe psychological harm. The distinction between those two categories is not semantic. It is the difference between a system making someone suffer and a system causing measurable, progressive, neurological damage. When you map the documented clinical stages of prolonged isolation against the specific years of Chris Watts's incarceration, something comes into focus that has never been laid out directly in any coverage of this case. In the first 12 months, deterioration begins with something that most people would not immediately recognize as damage. Time perception breaks down. The human brain does not track time passively. It marks time through novelty, through the small variations that distinguish 1 hour from the next, through the sensory information that signals change. When those variations are systematically removed, the internal clock stops functioning accurately. Days blur into one another. Hours become indistinguishable from long stretches of undifferentiated stillness. The person inside the cell stops experiencing time the way the rest of the world does. They experience something closer to an extended, uninterrupted present with no clear beginning and no identifiable end. By years 1 through 2, the next stage arrives. Researchers call it stimulus hunger. The brain, receiving no adequate input from its environment, begins generating its own. People in extended isolation report hearing sounds that are not present, noticing movement in their peripheral vision that does not exist, sensing presences in spaces they know to be empty. This is not psychological weakness. This is a biological response. The brain doing precisely what it was designed to do in an environment that is providing it almost nothing to work with. By years 3 through 5, the emotional architecture begins to change in ways the clinical literature distinguishes carefully from ordinary sadness or even standard depression. What sets in is characterized by emotional flattening, a blunting of response that makes the individual increasingly unreachable. Alongside that comes what researchers identify as the loss of future orientation, a clinical inability to imagine tomorrow in any concrete or motivating sense. People at this stage stop making plans, not because they have surrendered to defeat, but because the cognitive mechanism responsible for generating anticipation has been worn down by years of identical days with no future event substantial enough to anchor itself to. It was during this stage, years 3 through 5, that the first documented behavioral reports about Chris Watts began emerging from inside Dodge Correctional Institution. By years 5 through 7, the deterioration reaches the cognitive layer itself. Memory becomes unreliable. Concentration becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. And perhaps most significantly, the neural networks responsible for social processing begin to weaken. The systems that allow a human being to read another person's tone accurately, to follow the natural thread of a conversation, to interpret what is being communicated beneath the surface of the words being spoken, those systems require regular use to remain functional. In near total isolation, they do not receive that use. The research does not describe a stabilization point at year 7. It does not describe a plateau where the damage level's off and the individual finds a way to adjust. What the research describes is a direction, a line moving in one way only, governed by duration and duration alone. The behavioral changes that corrections officers at Dodge Correctional Institution are currently documenting sit precisely on that line, exactly where the research said they would be. Here is what those officers have actually been observing. Not rumors circulating through second-hand accounts, not speculation reconstructed from incomplete information. Documented behavioral changes reported by the men and women whose professional responsibility is to monitor Chris Watts every single day inside that facility. His official institutional record contains formal disciplinary citations, unauthorized communication, possession of contraband, refusal to follow direct orders from staff. On paper, those citations might appear to represent standard prison behavior. When you examine what those violations actually involved, the picture that emerges is something far more psychologically revealing than a defiant inmate working within a system he understands. At some point during his years at Dodge, Chris Watts transferred a collection of personal belongings to a fellow inmate named Dylan Tolman. When investigators reviewed the list of what he had given away, it was not contraband in any conventional sense. It was not currency or anything that carries value in a prison economy. What Chris Watts transferred to another man was his books, his hygiene products, his soap, his shampoo, his toothbrush, his underwear. Those are not items a person trades strategically. Those are the most intimate objects remaining in a life that has been stripped of almost everything else. The last genuinely private possessions in an existence that has no privacy left. And he gave them away not because of what he received in return materially, but because of what he received in return socially. Proximity. the constructed sensation of connection, the experience, however temporary and however manufactured, of not being completely alone. That is what those objects were worth to him in the economy of that cell. It did not stop there. Watts did not simply transfer belongings to Tolman within the facility walls. He began placing phone calls to Tolman's family members on the outside, and beyond that, he enlisted his own parents, who were still in occasional contact with him at that point, to reach out directly to Tolman's mother and girlfriend on his behalf. Consider the architecture of what that represents. A man inside a cell in Wisconsin, constructing a social network that extended across state lines, operating through a fellow inmate's family, using his own parents as intermediaries, simply to feel tethered to something beyond those walls. That is not the behavior of a mind functioning within normal social parameters. That is the behavior of someone whose understanding of appropriate boundaries has significantly deteriorated. Someone whose brain, deprived of genuine human connection for years, has begun reaching for substitutes with an urgency that a psychologically intact individual would immediately recognize as disproportionate. The line between appropriate and desperate had moved, and he could no longer locate where it used to be. Then, there is what corrections officers began reporting from inside the unit itself. Multiple staff members, independently and across separate accounts, noted the same thing. Chris Watts talks to himself. Not quietly, not occasionally, not the low murmuring of someone working through a thought. Sustained, audible conversation directed at no one present. Extended exchanges requiring a second voice that does not exist. During actual interactions with staff, officers, anyone who speaks to him directly, something else was observed with consistent regularity. Mid-conversation, without warning, he loses the thread. His gaze drifts. He fixes on something in the middle distance that no one else in the room can identify, and then he attempts to re-enter the exchange, sometimes picking up the exact sentence he was building before the gap, sometimes beginning somewhere entirely unrelated, as though the conversation had taken a turn that only he experienced. The people interacting with him notice it immediately. They have begun formally documenting it because it happens consistently enough to constitute a pattern. Before his incarceration, people who knew Chris Watts described him as careful about his personal appearance, attentive to how he presented himself, neat, deliberate about the image he projected. Reports from inside Dodge over recent years describe someone markedly different, someone who now goes multiple days without using the shower facilities even when access is available. Someone for whom basic self-maintenance has become inconsistent in a way that represents a clear departure from everything documented about who he was in 2018. That specific pattern, the decline of self-care in a person previously noted for their attention to appearance, appears in clinical isolation research with notable consistency. It is a documented behavioral marker of severe depression, compounded by cognitive decline, signaling that the internal motivation to maintain oneself has eroded past a threshold that most people never approach in a lifetime. And then, there is what happens at 3 in the morning. Corrections officers conducting overnight rounds inside Dodge have reported the same scene independently across multiple accounts. They pass the observation window on his cell in the early hours of the morning, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and he is awake, not reading, not writing, not moving. He is sitting on the edge of his bunk, completely still, staring directly at the wall in front of him, and he remains that way for hours. The clinical explanation for this is well established. The human brain regulates sleep through environmental signals, natural light variation, temperature change, social interaction, physical movement through space. In a cell where the overhead light does not change, where temperature is controlled and constant, where social contact is nearly absent and physical activity is severely restricted, the brain's ability to maintain a functioning sleep cycle breaks down. What corrections officers are observing at 3 in the morning is the documented result of that breakdown. Extended periods of motionless wakefulness during the hours when the rest of the facility is locked down and silent. He is not visibly distressed. He is not restless. He is simply present, staring, waiting for something that the locked-down darkness of a Wisconsin correctional facility in the early hours of the morning is never going to provide. This is not the beginning of that process. This is year 7 of it. Now, consider what has been happening in his correspondence, because the letters coming out of that cell carry a story of their own. Renewed documentary attention brought this case back into mainstream conversation through 2024 and into 2025, and the volume of mail reaching Chris Watts at Dodge increased significantly as a result. He receives more correspondence now than at almost any point since his first year of incarceration, and he responds to a substantial portion of it. Journalists have reviewed these letters. Forensic behavioral analysts have examined them. People who have corresponded with him directly have described their contents publicly. What those letters reveal follows a pattern specific enough to carry a clinical name. On the surface, they contain the language of accountability. He writes about Shanann. He writes about Bella and Celeste and Nico. He uses the language of remorse. He describes carrying the weight of what he did. Read quickly. Those passages might appear to represent genuine reckoning with what happened on that morning in Frederick, Colorado. And then the framing shifts. Sometimes in the next paragraph. Sometimes within the next sentence. The marriage had complications that people on the outside could not see. There were pressures that shaped him in ways that were never fully understood. Certain relationships altered his sense of who he was. And a phrase that appears in his correspondence with documented regularity: the whole picture is more complex than the public record reflects. Forensic psychologists identify this pattern with a specific clinical term: mitigation narrative construction. And it is important to understand precisely what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean Chris Watts is consciously sitting in that cell engineering a strategy to rehabilitate his public image. There is no legal mechanism that rewards him for doing so. He has no parole hearing approaching. He has no appeal pending that requires a sympathetic narrative. What the clinical literature suggests is that this pattern is not a strategy at all. It is something that happens at the level of psychological survival, in a mind that must find a way to coexist with what it carries, indefinitely, with no exit available. That is the question no coverage of this case has been willing to sit inside directly. What happens to a mind that cannot escape itself across 7 years? What does that process actually look like? And what does it mean for where Chris Watts stands right now in June 2026? Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She had survived serious health challenges, built a career, loved her daughters in a way that everyone who knew her recognized immediately as the central force of her life. Bella was 4. She was expressive and bright and fully, completely herself in the way that 4-year-olds are when they feel entirely safe. Celeste was 3. She had her own personality, her own particular joy, her own way of moving through the world. Nico had already been given a name. He had already been dreamed about. He never arrived. Those are the people this story belongs to. Every observation about what is happening inside a cell in Wisconsin exists within that context, and only within that context. The science matters. The behavioral documentation matters. The psychological framework matters. But none of it matters more than the fact that a woman came home from a work trip on the night of August 12, 2018, walked through the door of the house where her daughters were sleeping, and by morning, all of them were gone. That is what this documentary holds at its center, regardless of where the narration travels. The victims, their names, the lives they did not finish living. What comes next in this documentary goes into territory that has not been examined in this depth before. The full picture of what the psychological research says happens at exactly this stage of prolonged isolation. The specific behavioral documentation from inside Dodge that corrections officers have been reporting. And the one question at the center of all of it that the evidence raises but cannot fully answer. There is a point in the psychology of prolonged confinement where the mind stops simply enduring what it carries and begins quietly rebuilding around it. Not because the person makes a conscious choice to do so, not because they have decided to protect themselves from accountability, but because the alternative, holding the full, unfiltered, intact weight of reality with complete clarity, every single day, alone, for decades, inside 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete and institutional light, becomes more than a deteriorating psychology can sustain. When that threshold is crossed, the scaffolding goes up, not to deceive anyone on the outside, to make continued existence on the inside possible. The letters coming out of Dodge Correctional Institution reflect that process in real time. And in early 2026, a specific piece of correspondence emerged that made everything in the broader correspondence record suddenly crystallize into something far more significant than any individual letter had suggested on its own. Reported by the Daily Mail in early 2026, and based on letters dated from late 2025, Chris Watts wrote to a pen pal that God had placed him in prison deliberately, that his incarceration was not punishment in any conventional sense, that it was divine will, part of a larger plan designed specifically for him. And then he drew a direct comparison between his experience of imprisonment and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Let that sit for a moment. A man who in the early hours of August 13th, 2018, ended the life of his pregnant wife and both of his young daughters. A man who drove to a remote oil field that same morning and ensured that Bella and Celeste would never come home. That man wrote from his cell in Wisconsin in 2025 and drew a parallel between what he was experiencing and the suffering of the crucifixion. Forensic psychologists who have reviewed this correspondence do not describe it as exceptional narcissism. They describe it as precisely what the clinical literature predicts for someone at this specific stage of psychological deterioration under prolonged isolation. When the mind can no longer hold the actual weight of what it carries without fragmenting, it reframes that weight as significance. It transforms unbearable guilt into a narrative of cosmic purpose. It takes the inescapable and makes it meaningful, because meaningful suffering can be endured across decades in a way that purposeless suffering cannot. The brain does not do this because the person is uniquely broken or uniquely dangerous. It does this because it is running out of other options. That letter is not a window into who Chris Watts has always been. It is a window into what 7 years inside that cell has produced. In June 2026, Dylan Tolman, the inmate who had received Chris Watts's personal belongings and whose family had been contacted across state lines from inside Dodge, published an account based on his direct observations during their time at the facility together. What Tolman described, when measured against independent sources who had no contact with him and arrived at the same observations separately, carries a degree of corroboration that makes it worth examining carefully. According to Tolman's account, Chris Watts forms attachments quickly and intensely. When a woman writes to him, the correspondence does not develop the way most letter exchanges develop. Gradually, cautiously, two people finding a rhythm over time. It becomes consuming almost immediately. He organizes significant portions of his daily behavior around maintaining those connections, around the next letter, around the next response, around the next indication that someone on the outside is still paying attention to him and still choosing to write back. A source cited by People magazine with direct access to information about his situation inside Dodge confirmed a detail that anchors everything Tolman described and makes it concrete in a way that behavioral observation alone cannot. The majority of Chris Watts's weekly commissary budget does not go toward food. It does not go toward books or any other available comfort. It goes toward stamps and paper, week after week, year after year. The primary thing he spends the money available to him on is the ability to keep sending letters to women he has never met and will never meet in person. That detail matters beyond what it reveals about his daily routine, because the pattern it describes is not new. Forensic behavioral analysts who examined the history leading up to August 13, 2018, identified this same pattern as central to the events that preceded that morning. The intensity with which he pursued and maintained his relationship with Nicole Kessinger while Shanann was away on work trips. The way that connection reorganized his understanding of his own life and what he believed he wanted from it. The way it consumed his attention and restructured his daily priorities around maintaining it. That pattern did not end when the cell door at Dodge closed behind him. It adapted. It found new expression through envelopes and stamps and handwritten pages sent to women whose names he first learned from the return address on an incoming envelope. The underlying psychology remains the same, only the circumstances have changed around it. Tolman's account carries limitations that are important to acknowledge directly. He is reporting on what Watts told him, and Chris Watts is not a reliable narrator of his own experience or his own history. Nothing from Tolman's account is presented here as established fact without independent corroboration. But on the specific behavioral patterns he describes, the corroboration exists. It comes from multiple independent observers across multiple years, people who had no contact with each other and who arrived at the same observations through entirely separate channels. Every correctional facility operates on two simultaneous systems. The first is the official one, determined by the institution, reflected in housing assignments, privilege levels, and formal disciplinary records. The second is informal, unwritten, and understood by virtually every person who enters a facility within days of arrival, without anyone needing to state it explicitly. It is a social structure built on the nature of offenses, and it governs daily life in ways the official institutional system never fully reaches. At the upper levels of that informal structure sit inmates whose crimes, however serious, exist within a framework that prison culture has developed a way of processing. Toward the lower end sit those whose offenses the general population finds more difficult to accommodate. And at the very bottom, consistently, across facilities, across states, across decades of documented research into correctional social dynamics, sit people who caused harm to children. The reason is not complicated. A significant proportion of the men serving time in any given facility are fathers. They carry photographs. They count days toward the possibility of being present again in their children's lives. For those men, encountering someone who had exactly what they are separated from, a home, daughters who loved him, a family built across years, and who chose deliberately to destroy all of it, that encounter does not require discussion or deliberation. The response is immediate, and it is personal. Chris Watts has occupied the lowest position in that informal social structure since the day he arrived at Dodge. Former inmates who served time at the facility alongside him have been consistent on this point across separate accounts. Without corrections officers in direct proximity, his physical safety cannot be assumed. The yard carries a risk calculation he makes every time he enters it. The hallways have angles that are difficult to monitor continuously. Any space where supervision becomes uneven, even briefly, becomes a space where his presence creates a liability he has learned to account for. He is aware of all of this. He has been aware of it since his first week inside Dodge. It has never stopped being true for a single day of the more than 7 years he has been there. Researchers who study the psychology of high-profile incarceration describe what Chris Watts lives with as chronic unresolved threat awareness. And they describe it as one of the most psychologically corrosive conditions an inmate can experience across a long sentence. Not primarily because of the danger itself, but because of its permanence. It never resolves. There is no morning where the calculation changes and the alertness is no longer necessary. There is no version of Tuesday inside Dodge where his guard can come down and he simply exists in a space without threat. That sustained, unending state of vigilance does not exist alongside everything else he is experiencing in that cell. It compounds it. It accelerates the cognitive deterioration. It deepens the sleep disruption. It intensifies the social withdrawal. Every other stressor documented in his behavioral record becomes more severe when it sits inside a threat environment that is never going to go away. He moves through that facility with his head down. He avoids any space that is not directly and continuously supervised. When the choice is available between remaining in the cell and entering a common area, he chooses the cell. The room that is producing the psychological deterioration the corrections officers are documenting is also, simultaneously, the safest room available to him. That is the world Chris Watts wakes up inside every single morning, and according to the people who observe him daily, it is changing him in ways that show no sign of stopping. At the sentencing hearing on November 19, 2018, Frank Rzutki stood before the court and addressed the man who had taken his daughter, his grandchildren, and an unborn grandson from the world. He said, "You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every time you close your eyes at night." Those words were not spoken in anger alone. They were spoken by a father who had watched his daughter build a life, raise 2 little girls, prepare for the arrival of a 3rd child, and then had that entire future taken from him in a single morning. What Frank Rzutki was asking for was not abstract. He wanted the man responsible to carry the full weight of what he had done with complete awareness every day for as long as he lived. That is one of the most human things a person in that position could ask for. It is also the request that the clinical science around prolonged isolation forces this documentary to examine directly, because what the research actually shows is deeply uncomfortable. At a certain point in the progression of severe extended confinement, and the timeline varies by individual, but the threshold itself is consistent across study populations, the human brain loses a specific capacity. It loses the ability to hold cause alongside consequence with full coherence. The direct, intact, morally weighted connection between a choice made and what that choice produced begins to fragment under the sustained pressure of years of identical days with no external input to reinforce it. This is documented in peer-reviewed clinical literature across decades of research on isolated populations, including former prisoners of war and subjects in long-duration confinement studies. It is not a theory. It is a measured, replicated finding. What it means in practical terms is this: the person inside the cell does not forget what they did. Chris Watts knows he is in prison. He knows why he is there. That factual knowledge does not disappear, but the full, coherent, morally connected weight of it, the specific, intact experience of accountability that Frank Rzutki was asking for in that courtroom in November 2018, is precisely what prolonged isolation is documented to erode over time. The brain, stripped of the environmental and social reinforcement that keeps self-awareness grounded, begins to protect itself. It fragments the unbearable. It redistributes weight across external factors. It builds the narrative scaffolding. And eventually, the person inside the cell is no longer experiencing their punishment in the way the people who designed that punishment intended. They are experiencing isolation. They are experiencing the permanent, low-level threat of a facility that never fully feels safe. They are experiencing the mechanical repetition of days that are indistinguishable from one another, but the targeted, coherent, morally intact understanding of why, the very thing Frank Rzutki asked for, becomes harder to sustain with every passing year. This needs to be stated with complete clarity. 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole is exactly where Chris Watts belongs. Without qualification, without caveat, without any softening of that position, nothing in this documentary constitutes an argument for anything other than precisely what Judge Marcelo Kopkow handed down in November 2018. He will die inside Dodge Correctional Institution, That is the correct outcome for what he did to Shanann, to Bella, to Celeste, and to Nico. What is being examined here is something different. It is the gap. The significant, scientifically documented gap between what most people imagine long-term maximum security isolation delivers to a person and what the peer-reviewed research demonstrates it actually does to the human mind across a decade and beyond. Those are not the same thing. They have not been the same thing for a long time. And the behavioral changes that corrections officers at Dodge are currently describing are the documented evidence of that gap made visible in real time. It is June 2026. Chris Watts is 40 years old. He has been inside Dodge Correctional Institution for over 7 years. If he lives to average life expectancy, approximately 36 years remain inside that facility. The behavioral trajectory documented across his incarceration does not point towards stabilization. The corrections officers who observe him daily are not describing a man who has reached some kind of equilibrium or found a way to level out within the conditions he is living under. They are describing a man in a process that is still moving, still changing, still progressing in the direction the research mapped out years before anyone began paying close attention to what was coming out of Waupun, Wisconsin. The clinical literature is unambiguous on this point. There will likely come a point, the research suggests, within the next decade, possibly sooner, given what has already accumulated across 7 years, where Chris Watts can no longer sustain coherent self-awareness in any consistent sense, where the letters lose their internal organization, where the conversations with corrections officers become increasingly difficult to follow from one sentence to the next, where the intense relational attachments that currently structure what remains of his inner life become impossible to maintain, because the psychological capacity required to sustain them has degraded past any functional threshold. When that happens, 5 life sentences will still be running. The door will remain closed, the slot will still open with the meal tray. The overhead light will still fail to distinguish between 4 in the morning and noon. The overnight rounds will still pass his observation window. But the inner experience that gives those sentences their weight, the one Frank Rizuki stood in that courtroom and asked for, will have been slowly dismantled by the very conditions designed to deliver it. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She was a mother who documented her love for her daughters in videos and photographs and messages that still exist, that can still be watched, that still carry her voice and her laugh and her presence. Bella was 4 years old, and she knew how to fill a room. Celeste was 3, and she had her own specific, irreplaceable way of being in the world. Nico never got a day outside the womb. Those 4 people are the reason this case continues to matter. They are the reason the questions this documentary raises are worth asking. They are the reason the gap between what we imagine justice delivers and what the science shows it actually produces deserves to be examined honestly and without flinching. The guards at Dodge Correctional Institution are already describing a man who is not the same person who arrived in December 2018. They say it in the language available to them. Behavioral observations, documented incidents, things seen through observation windows during overnight rounds and quietly noted. What the forensic psychology and clinical isolation literature adds to what they are seeing is a framework, a name for what they are witnessing, and a projection grounded in decades of peer-reviewed research of where the line goes from here. He is not the same anymore. The guards are right about that. The question that the evidence raises, and that this channel is committed to continuing to examine with verified sources and documented reporting, is what, exactly, we are watching him become. 2 questions for the comments section, and this channel reads every single one. Do the behavioral changes that corrections officers are describing shift how you understand where this case stands in June 2026? Or does the evidence leave you exactly where you already were? And given what the clinical research shows about what prolonged isolation actually does to the human mind over time, Do you believe that what Frank Rzouki asked for in that courtroom in November 2018 is being fulfilled inside that cell right now? Leave your answer. Be honest about it. If you have made it to the end of this documentary, you already know that DAV Crime Records covers cases like this one with the depth and the documented sourcing they deserve. Cases where the story did not end when the cameras left. Cases where the science and the psychology never made it into the headlines. Cases where the people who were lost deserve to be remembered beyond the moment that made them famous. Subscribe to DAV Crime Records now if you are not already here. Turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next, and hit the like button if this coverage gave you something worth thinking about. It directly supports the work that goes into building documentaries at this level. These 4 lives, and the questions their story forces us to sit with, deserve nothing less than exactly this.